Welcome to my presentation on why Zenless Zone Zero redesigned Lucia. This has been a bit of a hot topic within the Zenless Zone Zero community, and as someone who extensively looks at HoYo's models because of my shorts, I feel like I am pretty equipped to talk about the design aspects of these changes, and I kind of want to explain why HoYo's might have decided to make these changes from a design standpoint so that you can have the most informed opinion you can. So to start off with the context, this character over here is Yixuan, who was the headliner character for 2.0, and her design was pretty polarizing to most people because it is so unique. You know, she has the high cut pants and then the asymmetry with one arm sleeve and then one leg sleeve. So some people liked it, some people didn't, and you know, that was all whatever. But then the 2.3 characters were drip marketed, and people noticed they kind of follow the exact same formula. You know, high cut pants, that goes up to like the chest area with dark colors, and then asymmetry. Lucia has asymmetry on her arms, Yudari has asymmetry on her legs. You know, it looks just a bit samey, right? So people were already not huge fans because of that. But then we got to see Lucia's model in game through this event. You know, it was one of those login type events, but it was cool that they implemented the character, and even though she wasn't involved a whole lot, we were able to see her model in its entirety as an NPC, which was pretty neat. I've seen some people say that the changes were caused by the Chinese community's criticisms, and you know, there's no hard evidence for that. The developers haven't communicated anything, unfortunately, but I am skeptical to believe that narrative because, like, here's one of the screenshots from Bilibili, a Chinese social media site, and this person, straight up calling her ugly, only has 400 upvotes. That's not a lot. There will always be people who dislike designs, right? And then this person who has the most upvotes with 1,300 is complaining about the skinny arms, which is also something the English community has been critical of, especially with Caesar in particular, who is supposed to be quite physically strong in the lore. So, you know, it would appear like it's just a vocal minority, and I don't think that the designers would actually decide to make the changes if they didn't also themselves think that the design could be improved. So that brings us to the changes, which were officially revealed in the 2.3 livestream with no developer comments on why it happened, and we can clearly see changes in the chest area. So this is the new one on the left. The ears got shorter, and then people also said the horns got smaller, but it's a little bit hard to tell from this comparison. And yeah, it's kind of funny that the Mindscape Cinema, you know, it's clearly meant to complement the original design, but we already know it was a last minute change because like this model was literally shown in game a few weeks ago, and it's not like it was a really old model because it was just recently introduced. So we already know there was a last minute change that didn't have to be proved. As for the English community's reception, it was pretty negative all across the board. And design is subjective, so you know, I think these people are free to think what they want. But I do think it's still important to try and see both sides of the argument. So here's Lucia's design as it was in the NPC version. And okay, you might not believe me when I say this, but when I saw this in game playing the event, I did genuinely think it looked a little bit off. And specifically in this upper chest area, which is, you know, what got changed. And I think the reason for that is because this entire torso area kind of all melds together into one dark blob. I mean, you got the chest window in the middle, but it doesn't really do much for the overall silhouette because it's just kind of stranded there in the middle. And I think this entire thing contributes to her torso looking a little bit longer than it should be. And it also makes it a bit harder to make out some of her features, like where her neck is, and then the hood, where her shoulders are. And then because the jacket kind of juts out a little bit, I just think this whole area looks like one big blob and it looks a little bit too long. And I think we can see that a little bit better here. Again, I think this entire area looks a little bit long. And I think they also adjusted her proportions too, to make her chest a little bit wider and make her hips a little bit smaller, I guess. Yeah, maybe that part wasn't totally necessary, but I do think that giving her the exposed skin up here does break up the dark shapes a lot. And then you could also clearly see her neck better. And then I don't think anyone has mentioned this, but the hood was seemingly made smaller or like flatter. And then the sides of the jackets were pushed out a little bit, so you can make out her shoulders much more easily. Now, understandably, this was at the cost of probably her most unique defining feature, and it's also notable that, you know, this string kind of bikini top design is very similar to Yixuan, so it, you know, even further pushes the narrative that they look really similar. So on that front, I really do understand the criticism, but I think in terms of like shape language and readability, I much prefer this design over this one. Yeah, and you might be thinking that I'm just making this all up, but this is genuinely something that designers do think about, and one of my favorite examples is the mercenaries from TF2. We can see that generally speaking, the classes, they all have pretty dark neutral colors on their legs, and then brighter colors around their torsos, which are also very square in shape, and that kind of lends itself to the game design of most of the guns don't headshot, so you pretty much are aiming here, and that's naturally where your eyes lead you to when you look at these characters. I would like to back up my points with evidence, so real quick we're going to take a look at Miyabi's model. These models are not mine, by the way, credit to the Chinese user who uploaded them on playbox.com. Here we have the playable 1.3 model, and then we also have the older closed beta model, which was also used as her NPC model up until she was released in 1.3. Now you probably have seen the meme before, but originally her eyes were pretty far apart, and you can see that compared to the newer version, which also looks different because it's shaded, of course. But the eyes do look a bit more natural because they're closer together. But then they also, like, you know, slim down the face. It would probably be pretty hard to tell these things if you didn't see them side by side. But we can see that they slim down the face, they changed the eye shape, and they also made the bangs look much better. So that overall contributes to a much cleaner looking face, and compared to her old one, which looked a bit silly in some respects. But the face isn't the only thing that changed. Like, they had her hand badge changed to a section 6 badge, which is a little bit more apt for a character. Her belt, which has this like handshake thing, clearly so much better, like way more readable. Like, yeah, this gets the idea across, but the shapes just look really off. This, you very clearly understand what it's going for, right? And then they also made changes to stuff like her gloves, which became a little bit more cleaner looking. Other small touch-ups like around her shoes, little belt here, and then some other like more subjective changes, like they changed the section 6 logo from this stylization of the special symbol to this one, which is a little bit cleaner. It's more readable if you know what the character is supposed to look like. So clearly we can see they have a focus on shape language and readability, and then some aspects of like what makes a character look good, which is going to trend on the more subjective side. But you know, some people, they preferred her old eye shape, and we can see his edit here. Unfortunately, the user deleted their account, but you know, a lot of the comments agreed that, you know, they like this interpretation of the character. But personally, I think there's nothing wrong with this one. I think this one, you know, fits like the silly side of her personality, but we don't really get to see that until you get to know the character a little bit better. In which case, I think the one that is currently in the game, you know, which feels more appropriate for her status as a Void Hunter, and I think this serious look fits her quite well. So moving on to the other thing that Lucia had changed, which was her ears. I want to say that this is because of her hood. And so I have another example with Gaming from Genshin, because we can see here that he is also a character that has a hood. So we can see that the way they do it here is that the hood is separate from the rest of his body, and it's just a little toggle between the up version and the down version. But the thing is, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because if you just put the hood up on his regular model, his hair pokes through on all the sides, his hair spike at the top, and well, his ponytail, that was taken into account because they have like a little slot for it. But we can see that in order to get the hood to actually look how it's supposed to, they kind of have to tuck all the hair away inside, and that does change how he looks from the front just a little bit. But it's also a little bit more of a hassle to animate, since you have to make sure that none of this is clipping through while the hood stays on. So to me, I think it could be very reasonable that they wanted to shorten the ears so that when she puts the hood on, it's not poking out, and it's also not completely like folded in. You know, maybe they just thought, you know, if she's gonna wear the hood, it might be a little bit uncomfortable for her to fold in her ears all the time, so it just makes more sense to make them a little bit shorter. And they are still a prominent part of her character design, so in that respect, I can kind of understand why they would have done something like that. And there were arguments that, oh, people in the Chinese community said that her ears were too long and it looked weird, but, you know, here we have Orpheus, and her ears are pretty long. Like, sure, they are obfuscated by her horns and her hair a little bit, but if they did it for Lucia, why didn't they do it for Orpheus? You know, I think it more has to do with the hood, in my opinion. So that's where we are with Lucia now. I mean, you know, you could see some things like her proportions don't really look like they fit the new model for some of these official artworks. So it is still a bit of a weird situation, but I do think that from a purely design perspective, the changes do have some merit to them. They weren't just made for no reason. That's not to say that you have to like them, but I don't think they were done with no intention. And look, the designers are still cooking. These are the next few characters that got announced, and I think their designs are complete bangers. You know, they aren't the same one note as these characters. They're very much different and unique. So I don't agree with the sentiment that, you know, the designers have lost their touch or they're just repeating stuff now. I just think that, you know, if you happen to not like these designs, they are a bit repetitive in some regards. That's okay. The designers are still cooking.